Somewhere in the 1920s, physics stopped making intuitive sense. Objects could exist in multiple states simultaneously until observed. Particles separated by vast distances appeared to influence each other instantaneously. The very act of measurement seemed to determine outcomes rather than merely reveal them. These discoveries unsettled not just physicists, but philosophers, mathematicians, and eventually anyone attempting to understand what measurement and observation actually meant. Around the same time, neuroscience was beginning to map the physical correlates of mental states with increasing precision. Specific brain regions corresponded to specific functions. Damage to particular areas produced predictable deficits. The materialist picture seemed to be working, yet one problem persisted. No amount of correlation between neural activity and subjective experience explained why physical processes should feel like anything at all. The explanatory gap between objective brain states and subjective conscious experience remained stubbornly open. These two mysteries, quantum measurement and conscious experience, emerged from completely different research programs. One concerned the behavior of subatomic particles. The other concerned the nature of human awareness. There was no obvious reason they should be related. Yet by the 1990s, a small group of serious scientists began suggesting they might be. The question isn't whether quantum mechanics is weird. That's established. The question is whether its weirdness has anything to do with the weirdness of consciousness, or whether linking them represents what Stephen Hawking once called putting two mysteries together and hoping they explain each other. To understand why this question still matters requires looking at what quantum mechanics actually revealed about measurement, what neuroscience has struggled to explain about consciousness, and where those two problems might genuinely intersect versus where they merely seem to. Consider what happens during quantum measurement. Before measurement, a particle exists in a superposition of possible states. The mathematics describes it as being in multiple configurations simultaneously. Upon measurement, this superposition collapses to a single definite state. The standard interpretation says nothing about why or how this collapse occurs, only that it does when measurement happens. For decades, physicists largely avoided asking what constituted a measurement. The theory worked. Predictions matched experiments with extraordinary precision. The philosophical questions about what measurement meant seemed secondary to the practical success of the formalism. But some physicists couldn't leave it alone. John von Neumann, one of the 20th century's most rigorous mathematical minds, traced the measurement chain backward. A particle interacts with a detector. The detector registers a result. That result gets recorded on a computer. A scientist reads the computer screen. Where exactly does the collapse occur? Von Neumann concluded that the chain had to terminate somewhere outside the physical system being described, potentially in consciousness itself. Eugene Wigner extended this reasoning. If quantum mechanics describes all physical systems, and if all physical systems remain in superposition until measured, then the measurement apparatus itself should be in superposition. The laboratory should be in superposition. The scientist's brain should be in superposition. The only thing that can't be in superposition, Wigner argued, is consciousness itself, the direct experience of observing a definite outcome. This led to what became known as the consciousness causes collapse interpretation. It suggests that conscious observation literally determines quantum outcomes. Most physicists rejected this immediately. It seemed to grant consciousness a privileged role in physics without any mechanism or evidence. It felt like bringing minds into fundamental physics through the back door. Yet the alternative interpretations also carried costs. The many worlds interpretation eliminated collapse entirely by claiming every possible outcome occurs in branching parallel universes. Copenhagen interpretation simply declared measurement a primitive concept not requiring further explanation. Objective collapse theories propose new physics where wave functions spontaneously collapse at certain mass or complexity thresholds. Each approach solved one problem while creating others. What's remarkable isn't that some physicists proposed consciousness might play a role in quantum mechanics. It's that the standard theory left room for the question at all. Classical physics never invited such speculation. Objects existed in definite states, whether observed or not. Quantum mechanics introduced genuine ambiguity about what constituted physical reality absent observation. Meanwhile, neuroscience faced its own explanatory crisis. By the mid-1990s, sophisticated imaging techniques could track neural correlates of consciousness with impressive detail. Specific patterns of neural firing corresponded to specific conscious experiences. Damage to particular brain regions produced predictable alterations in consciousness. The correlations were real and robust, but correlation isn't explanation. Philosopher David Chalmers articulated what he called the hard problem of consciousness. Why do certain physical processes give rise to subjective experience at all? You can explain how the brain processes visual information, integrates sensory inputs, generates behavioral outputs. You can map every neural correlation, but none of that explains why processing visual information feels like seeing red, or why integrated information feels like anything rather than proceeding in darkness. Some neuroscientists dismiss this as a pseudo-problem. Consciousness, they argued, simply is what complex information processing feels like from the inside. Once you fully explain the functional architecture, nothing remains to explain. The hard problem dissolves under sufficient mechanistic understanding. Others weren't convinced. The explanatory gap seemed genuine. You could imagine systems that performed all the same information processing without any accompanying experience. Philosophical zombies, functionally identical but subjectively dark. Whether such systems were metaphysically possible didn't matter. The conceptual distinction between function and experience seemed real enough to demand explanation. This set the stage for quantum consciousness theories. If classical neuroscience couldn't bridge the gap between physical processes and subjective experience, perhaps quantum mechanics offered resources classical physics lacked. Maybe consciousness required quantum coherence, quantum entanglement, or quantum computation. Maybe the measurement problem in physics and the hard problem in philosophy of mind were somehow the same problem viewed from different angles. The most prominent proposal came from Roger Penrose and Stuart-Hameroff in the mid-1990s. Penrose, a mathematical physicist who had worked on black holes and space-time singularities, approached the problem through Gödel's incompleteness theorems. He argued that human mathematical understanding exhibited non-computable aspects that no algorithmic system could capture. If consciousness involved non-computable processes, it couldn't be implemented by classical neural computation. It required physics beyond standard quantum mechanics, specifically a process Penrose called objective reduction. Objective reduction proposed that quantum superpositions don't remain indefinite forever. They spontaneously collapse when the difference in space-time curvature between superposed states reaches a threshold. Each collapse would constitute a moment of conscious experience. Consciousness wouldn't merely observe quantum events, it would be quantum events orchestrated by cellular structures called microtubules. Hameroff contributed the biological implementation. He had observed that single-celled organisms, like paramecia, displayed complex behavior despite lacking synapses or neural networks. Something about cellular structure itself supported sophisticated information processing. Microtubules, protein structures forming the cellular skeleton, seemed like plausible candidates. They were ubiquitous in neurons, formed regular lattices that might support quantum computation, and contained hydrophobic pockets that might protect quantum states from environmental decoherence. The orchestrated objective reduction theory, or ORCH OR, proposed that consciousness emerged from quantum computations in microtubules, with each objective reduction event corresponding to a discrete moment of conscious experience. The theory attempted to solve three problems simultaneously: the measurement problem in quantum mechanics, the hard problem of consciousness, and the question of how free will could exist in a deterministic universe. Most neuroscientists and physicists regarded ORC OR with deep skepticism. The brain seemed like the worst possible environment for maintaining delicate quantum states. It was warm, wet, and metabolically noisy, exactly the conditions that cause rapid decoherence. Physicist Max Tegmark calculated that quantum coherence in microtubules would collapse in less than a trillionth of a second, far too brief to influence neural processes occurring on millisecond timescales. But the theory wouldn't die, partly because Penrose and Hameroff continued developing it with genuine scientific care, proposing specific mechanisms and testable predictions, partly because discoveries in other biological systems suggested quantum effects weren't as impossible in warm environments as initially thought. Quantum coherence had been demonstrated in photosynthesis and bird navigation. Biology seemed capable of harnessing quantum phenomena after all. More fundamentally, the theory persisted because the problems it addressed remained unsolved. Classical neuroscience still struggled to explain how subjective experience emerges from neural activity. Quantum mechanics still lacked consensus on what measurement actually meant. Whether ORCH OR provided correct answers, it at least asked serious questions about how physical processes could generate conscious experience. The debate crystallized around several key issues. First, whether quantum effects could survive long enough in biological tissue to influence neural processing. Second, whether quantum processes, even if present, would be relevant to consciousness or merely background noise. Third, whether invoking quantum mechanics solved the hard problem or merely relocated it from classical to quantum processes. And finally, whether the question could be answered experimentally or remained fundamentally philosophical. Recent developments have shifted some of these debates. Experimental work on microtubules has revealed unexpected quantum effects persisting at room temperature. Studies on anesthesia have suggested that consciousness might indeed involve quantum processes in ways that could be tested. Proposals from Google's Quantum AI Lab have outlined experiments using quantum computers to probe consciousness directly. The question has moved from purely theoretical speculation toward potential empirical investigation. Yet skepticism remains warranted. The history of quantum mysticism, using quantum mechanics to justify paranormal claims or pseudoscience, makes serious scientists cautious about any theory linking quantum physics to consciousness. The burden of proof is high, appropriately so. Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. What makes quantum consciousness theories worth examining isn't that they're obviously correct. They're not. Most neuroscientists working on consciousness don't invoke quantum mechanics. Most quantum physicists working on foundational questions don't invoke consciousness. The theories remain speculative and controversial, but they're worth examining because they highlight deep unresolved problems at the intersection of physics, neuroscience, and philosophy. They force us to articulate clearly what would constitute an adequate explanation of consciousness. They push us to specify exactly what quantum mechanics tells us about measurement and observation. They test the boundaries of current scientific understanding. The question isn't settled. The next parts of this exploration will examine the specific mechanisms proposed, the experimental evidence both for and against, the philosophical implications, and what remains genuinely unknown. Whether quantum effects play a meaningful role in consciousness remains open. But understanding why the question persists, why serious scientists continue investigating despite skepticism, reveals something important about the limits of current theories and the nature of explanatory gaps that remain. The decoherence problem appeared fatal to quantum consciousness theories when Max Tegmark published his calculations in 2000. But reality, as it often does, proved more stubborn than the mathematics initially suggested. Tegmark's original estimate placed quantum coherence lifetimes in neural microtubules at around 10 to the negative 12 seconds, a trillionth of a second. Neural processes operate on millisecond timescales. The gap seemed insurmountable. Quantum effects would collapse billions of times faster than neurons could fire. The theory looked dead. Yet within a few years, physicists, including Scott Hagen, demonstrated that Tegmark's model contained specific assumptions about how quantum states would interact with their surroundings. When those assumptions were refined, accounting for the actual structure of microtubules, the screening effects of surrounding ions, the ordered water layers that coat these structures, the decoherence time extended dramatically. Not to milliseconds yet, but to microseconds. Still short of what neural processes require, but no longer absurdly so. The question shifted from impossible to merely very difficult. Around the same time, quantum biology began revealing something unexpected. Photosynthesis, the process by which plants convert light to chemical energy, appeared to exploit quantum coherence. Energy transfer in light-harvesting complexes seemed to involve superposition states persisting for hundreds of femtoseconds at room temperature. Biological systems weren't just tolerating quantum effects, they were harnessing them. Birds navigating by Earth's magnetic field showed evidence of quantum entanglement in specialized proteins in their eyes. The mechanism involved radical pairs, molecules with unpaired electrons whose spins could become entangled, with the entanglement sensitive to magnetic field orientation. Warm, wet, noisy biological tissue maintaining quantum effects long enough to influence behavior. These discoveries didn't prove quantum consciousness theories correct. They demonstrated that the blanket dismissal based on decoherence was premature. Biology had evolved mechanisms, though still not fully understood, for protecting quantum coherence in thermal environments. The question became more specific, not whether quantum effects could survive in biological tissue, but whether they played any functional role in neural processes related to consciousness. This is where experimental work on anesthesia became crucial. Anesthetics have been used clinically for over a century and a half, yet their mechanism of action remains incompletely understood. They reliably induce unconsciousness across an extraordinary range of chemical structures, from simple noble gases like xenon to complex molecules. The Meyer-Overton correlation established in the early 1900s, showed that anesthetic potency correlates remarkably well with how easily molecules dissolve in lipids. The more lipid-soluble, the more potent as an anesthetic. This suggested anesthetics work by dissolving into cell membranes and disrupting their function through purely physical means. No need for specific binding sites or targeted molecular interactions. Just partition into fatty tissue and disturb membrane properties. But the correlation, while strong, isn't perfect. Some molecules that should be potent anesthetics based on their lipid solubility aren't. Some that shouldn't be effective are. The correlation points toward membrane involvement, but doesn't fully explain the mechanism. More recent work has identified specific proteins that anesthetics bind to: ion channels, receptors, gap junction proteins, and microtubules. Anesthetics bind to the hydrophobic pockets in tubulin proteins, the building blocks of microtubules. This matters because those hydrophobic pockets are precisely where Hameroff proposed quantum effects might occur. Shielded from the surrounding water, these pockets could theoretically maintain quantum coherence longer than exposed molecular structures. In 2013, researchers at the University of Alberta found that when rats were given a drug that binds to microtubules and stabilizes them, the onset of anesthesia was delayed. The microtubule stabilizing drug interfered with the anesthetic's ability to induce unconsciousness. The results suggested anesthetics might work, at least in part, by disrupting processes occurring in microtubules. More striking was work showing anesthetic effects on quantum properties of microtubules directly. When researchers at Princeton used lasers to excite molecules within tubulin proteins, they observed that the excitation energy propagated through the microtubule network farther and persisted longer than classical physics would predict. When the same experiments were repeated in the presence of anesthetics, these propagation patterns changed significantly. A 2024 study confirmed something called superradiance in networks of tryptophan molecules within microtubules. Superradiance is a quantum effect where multiple molecules emit light collectively in a coordinated fashion, releasing energy faster than isolated molecules would. It requires quantum coherence among the emitting molecules. The observation of superradiance in microtubules at physiological temperatures was unexpected. The effect shouldn't survive in such noisy environments, yet it does, and anesthetics disrupt it. This doesn't prove consciousness depends on quantum processes. It shows that quantum effects occur in structures that anesthetics target, and that anesthetics alter those quantum effects in ways correlated with loss of consciousness. Correlation, not causation, but suggestive correlation. The universality of anesthetic action provides another puzzle. The same gases that render humans unconscious also affect single-celled organisms, like paramecia. They slow or stop their movement, their apparent responsiveness to stimuli. Plants show similar responses. Anesthetics that work on human brains work on organisms with no neurons at all. This universality is difficult to explain if consciousness requires complex neural networks. If anesthesia works by disrupting specific patterns of neural activity, synchronization across brain regions, feedback loops between cortex and thalamus, why would the same chemicals affect organisms lacking those structures? One explanation: consciousness, or at least some precursor to it, exists at the cellular level, involving structures common to all eukaryotic cells. Microtubules are ubiquitous. Single-celled organisms have them, plant cells have them, neural cells have them in abundance. If quantum states in microtubules contribute to consciousness, disrupting those states would affect any organism possessing them, regardless of whether it has a brain. This reasoning is speculative. Alternative explanations exist. Anesthetics might simply disrupt cellular metabolism or basic membrane functions required for any responsive behavior. The universality might reflect shared biochemistry rather than shared consciousness. But the universality does constrain theories. Any explanation of anesthetic action must account for effects across radically different organisms. Neural network theories struggle with this. Microtubule theories have a natural explanation. Recent theoretical work has proposed mechanisms by which quantum coherence might be protected in biological systems. Error correction schemes, similar to those used in quantum computers, could theoretically operate in biological structures. Ordered water layers surrounding microtubules might shield quantum states from thermal noise. Debye layers of ions could provide additional screening. Whether these mechanisms actually exist and function in living neurons remains unknown. The theoretical possibility exists. Experimental confirmation does not. Another line of investigation focuses on isotope effects in anesthesia. Xenon, a noble gas used as an anesthetic, exists in multiple stable isotopes. These isotopes are chemically identical, same number of electrons, same chemical bonding properties. They differ only in nuclear mass and nuclear spin, purely quantum properties. Some studies suggest different xenon isotopes have slightly different anesthetic potencies. If confirmed, this would be difficult to explain classically. Chemical mechanisms depend on electron configurations, which are identical across isotopes. Nuclear spin affects molecular behavior only through quantum mechanical pathways. The isotope effect remains controversial. Some experiments find it, others don't. Measurement is technically challenging. But if real, it would provide strong evidence that quantum properties influence anesthetic action, and by extension, consciousness. The most ambitious experimental proposals come from Google's Quantum AI Lab. Hartmut Neven, who leads the lab, has outlined experiments using quantum computers to directly test quantum consciousness hypotheses. One proposal involves entangling human subjects with qubits in a quantum processor. The idea, if consciousness depends on quantum coherence or entanglement, artificially increasing the quantum complexity of the system coupled to a person's brain, should produce measurable changes in their conscious experience. Subjects would report whether they experience altered awareness, enhanced clarity, or qualitative changes in perception, while their neural activity is entangled with engineered quantum systems. Control conditions would use classical correlations without genuine quantum entanglement. The technical challenges are enormous. Creating stable entanglement between macroscopic biological systems and quantum computers. Maintaining coherence long enough for neural processes to potentially utilize it. Designing protocols that actually test consciousness rather than just measuring neural noise. The experiments haven't been performed yet. They may not be feasible with current technology, but they represent the first serious attempts to move quantum consciousness theories from philosophical speculation toward empirical testing using actual quantum systems. Whether these experiments will work, what they might find if they do, and how results would be interpreted remain open questions. The proposals demonstrate that quantum consciousness theories have matured enough to generate testable predictions, even if testing remains extremely difficult. The question has moved from purely theoretical to experimentally approachable. Not yet approached, but approachable. That represents progress. even if the ultimate answers remain unknown. What's clear is that quantum effects do occur in biological systems, including neural structures. What remains unclear is whether those effects matter for consciousness or merely constitute quantum noise irrelevant to the hard problem of subjective experience. The problem isn't whether quantum mechanics exists in the brain. It does. Electrons are quantum objects. So are the atoms that compose neurons, microtubules, and every other biological structure. The real question is whether quantum mechanics explains anything about consciousness that classical physics cannot. Whether invoking quantum theory moves us toward an answer or merely reframes the mystery in more fashionable terminology. This distinction matters because the history of consciousness studies is littered with theories that borrowed prestige from cutting-edge physics without actually explaining subjective experience. In the 19th century, electromagnetic fields were the promising frontier. Consciousness was proposed as a field phenomenon, an emanation of neural electricity. That didn't work. In the 20th century, holography became fashionable. The brain was a hologram, consciousness a wave interference pattern. That also didn't work. Now quantum mechanics holds that role. The question is whether this time is different. The case for quantum consciousness rests on several claims, some stronger than others. The weakest claim is merely that quantum mechanics is strange and consciousness is strange, therefore they might be related. Stephen Hawking dismissed this as combining mysteries rather than solving them. The criticism has force. Quantum superposition is puzzling. Subjective experience is puzzling. Putting them together doesn't automatically reduce either puzzle to something more comprehensible, but there are stronger arguments. One focuses on the unity of conscious experience. When you perceive a red apple, color processing happens in one brain region, shape recognition in another, object identification in a third. Yet you experience a single unified object, not disconnected sensory fragments. This is the binding problem. How do spatially separated neural processes combine into one coherent experience? Classical physics offers no obvious mechanism for creating genuine unity from distinct parts. Quantum entanglement does. Entangled particles form non-separable wholes. Their quantum state cannot be factored into independent components. If consciousness involves quantum entanglement across neural structures, the binding problem might have a physical solution. This argument gains traction from work on panprotopsychism, the view that reality's fundamental constituents possess primitive forms of experience that combine to produce a complex consciousness. Classical physics struggles with the combination problem. How do countless micro-experiences merge into one unified field of awareness? Quantum mechanics potentially solves this through entanglement's holistic character. The combined quantum state isn't built from separate pieces. It's fundamentally unified from the start. Whether this solution works depends on whether biological systems can maintain quantum entanglement long enough to matter for neural processing. Entanglement is fragile. Interaction with the environment typically destroys it within femtoseconds in warm, noisy systems like living tissue. This is the decoherence objection. Max Tegmark calculated that quantum coherence in neural microtubules would collapse far too quickly to influence brain function. His analysis suggested decoherence times around 10 to the minus 12 seconds. Neural signaling operates on millisecond timescales. If Tegmark's calculation holds, quantum effects are neurophysiologically irrelevant. But the calculation depends on assumptions about how microtubules interact with their environment. Subsequent work by Hagen and others suggested decoherence times might reach microseconds under certain conditions, potentially extending to milliseconds if biological systems evolved protective mechanisms. Ordered water layers surrounding microtubules could provide shielding. Debye layers of counterions might screen quantum states from thermal noise. Error correction schemes analogous to those in quantum computers might operate in biological structures. None of this is established. The theoretical possibility exists. Experimental confirmation does not. What experiments have shown is that quantum effects can persist in biological systems under some circumstances. Quantum coherence plays a role in photosynthesis, where energy transfer through light harvesting complexes involves coherent superposition states lasting hundreds of femtoseconds. Avian magnetoreception appears to depend on quantum entanglement in cryptochromes, proteins in bird retinas sensitive to Earth's magnetic field through radical pair mechanisms involving entangled electron spins. These examples prove biology can exploit quantum phenomena. They don't prove consciousness requires them. Photosynthesis and magnetoreception involve specialized molecular structures optimized for quantum effects. Consciousness might not. Classical neural dynamics might suffice to explain subjective experience without invoking quantum mechanics at all. Recent experimental work has focused on microtubules, cylindrical protein structures forming the cytoskeleton of neurons. Anirban Bandyopadhyay's group found evidence of resonant vibrations in microtubules at room temperature, suggesting possible quantum coherence. Gregory Scholes and Arat Kalra at Princeton used lasers to excite molecules in tubulin proteins, observing that excitation propagated farther through microtubules than expected. When they repeated the experiment under anesthesia, the effect vanished. This suggests anesthetics disrupt whatever process allows extended excitation propagation through microtubules. A 2024 study identified superradiance in networks of tryptophan molecules distributed through tubulin. Superradiance is a quantum phenomenon where coherently excited molecules emit light collectively, producing enhanced radiation compared to independent emission. Finding superradiance in microtubules at biological temperatures is significant because such quantum effects weren't expected in warm, disordered biological environments. But whether superradiance or extended excitation propagation matter for consciousness remains unknown. They demonstrate quantum effects occur in neural structures. They don't demonstrate those effects generate subjective experience. The strongest empirical test of quantum consciousness theories comes from anesthesia research. General anesthetics reliably eliminate consciousness across vastly different organisms. Humans, insects, plants, single-celled organisms all lose responsiveness under appropriate anesthetic exposure. This universality suggests anesthesia targets something fundamental to biological organization rather than complex neural networks specific to brains. The Meyer-Overton correlation, established over a century ago, shows anesthetic potency correlates with lipid solubility across several orders of magnitude. This suggests anesthetics act at hydrophobic sites in cellular structures. Microtubule theory proposes that hydrophobic pockets in tubulin proteins, where quantum effects might occur, are exactly the sites where anesthetics bind. If consciousness depends on quantum coherence in microtubules, disrupting that coherence should eliminate consciousness. Several experiments support this interpretation. Drugs that bind to microtubules delay unconsciousness under anesthesia in rats, suggesting microtubule binding interferes with anesthetic action. Anesthetics hasten delayed luminescence in microtubules, consistent with disruption of quantum processes. Yet classical explanations for anesthetic action also exist. Anesthetics might affect synaptic transmission, gap junctions, or various receptor systems through entirely classical mechanisms. The fact that anesthetics have hydrophobic binding sites doesn't prove those sites involve quantum processes. The universality of anesthetic action across organisms could reflect common cellular machinery rather than quantum substrates of consciousness. The most ambitious test of quantum consciousness theories comes from proposals to directly manipulate quantum states in human subjects. Hartmut Neven at Google's Quantum AI Lab has outlined experiments using quantum computers to test whether artificially entangling human neural activity with engineered quantum systems produces measurable changes in conscious experience. Subjects would report whether their awareness feels different when their brain activity becomes entangled with qubits compared to control conditions involving classical correlations without genuine quantum entanglement. These experiments face enormous technical challenges, creating stable entanglement between biological systems and quantum processes, maintaining coherence long enough for neural processes to respond, designing protocols that test consciousness rather than measuring irrelevant neural noise. The experiments haven't been performed. Whether they're even feasible with current technology remains unclear, but they represent the first serious attempts to move quantum consciousness theories from philosophical speculation toward empirical testing using actual quantum systems. If such experiments succeed and show positive results, they would constitute strong evidence that quantum effects matter for consciousness. If they fail or show no effect, the negative result would be informative but not conclusive. Failure might indicate consciousness doesn't involve quantum processes, or it might indicate that the artificial quantum systems used in the experiment don't couple to neural processes in the right way to influence consciousness. Distinguishing these possibilities would require additional experiments with different designs. The current state of quantum consciousness research is this: quantum effects do occur in biological systems, including neural structures. Whether those effects are relevant to consciousness or constitute quantum noise, irrelevant to subjective experience, remains unresolved. The theoretical motivation for quantum theories comes from unsolved problems in consciousness studies, like the binding problem and the hard problem of why physical processes generate subjective experience at all. Quantum mechanics offers potential solutions through entanglement and objective reduction. Whether those solutions actually work is an open empirical question that experiments are only beginning to address. What's certain is that invoking quantum mechanics doesn't automatically solve the hard problem. Even if consciousness depends on quantum coherence or entanglement, it remains unclear why those particular physical processes should be associated with subjective experience rather than proceeding unconsciously like most physical processes. Quantum theories potentially explain how unified conscious experience could arise from distributed neural activity. They don't obviously explain why any physical process generates qualia at all, but there's a deeper question hiding beneath these experimental debates. Even if quantum processes occur in neurons, even if coherence lasts longer than expected, even if anesthetics disrupt quantum states, none of this automatically explains why those processes should generate subjective experience. The hard problem remains. Consider what consciousness actually means in this context. When you see red, that experience has a qualitative character. Philosophers call this qualia. The redness of red isn't just wavelength information processed by your visual cortex. It's the subjective feeling of seeing red, the what, its likeness, that makes conscious experience different from unconscious information processing. A camera processes light without experiencing anything. Your brain processes light and you see colour. What's the difference? Classical neuroscience approaches this by mapping correlations. When neurons fire in specific patterns, people report seeing red. When different patterns activate, they report seeing blue. But correlation isn't explanation. Showing that neural activity correlates with conscious experience doesn't explain why those particular physical processes generate subjective experience rather than proceeding in the dark, like most physical processes. Quantum consciousness theories attempt to bridge this gap by proposing that quantum processes have special properties that classical processes lack. Penrose argues that quantum superposition and objective reduction introduce genuine novelty into the universe, allowing for non-computable aspects of conscious thought. Quantum entanglement creates holistic states where the whole cannot be reduced to its parts, potentially explaining the unity of conscious experience. The quantum measurement problem suggests that observation plays a fundamental role in determining outcomes, hinting at a connection between consciousness and physics. But here's where the skeptics push back hardest. Just because quantum mechanics is weird doesn't mean it explains consciousness. David Chalmers, who formulated the hard problem, makes this point explicitly. If you can't explain why classical neural firing generates subjective experience, you haven't gained anything by replacing classical processes with quantum processes. The explanatory gap remains. Why should quantum coherence in microtubules feel like anything? Why should objective reduction generate qualia? The quantum theory needs to answer these questions, not just invoke quantum strangeness. Stephen Hawking expressed this skepticism memorably. He characterized Penrose's argument as, "Consciousness is a mystery. Quantum gravity is a mystery. Therefore, they must be related." This criticism cuts deep. Are quantum consciousness theories solving a problem or merely replacing one mystery with another? Defenders respond that quantum mechanics does offer something genuinely new. Classical physics describes a deterministic universe, where the future follows inevitably from the past according to fixed laws. Quantum mechanics introduces fundamental indeterminacy. Measurements don't reveal pre-existing properties but actively participate in determining outcomes. This participatory aspect potentially connects consciousness to physical reality in ways classical physics cannot accommodate. The binding problem provides another potential opening. Your conscious experience is unified. When you see a red apple, you don't experience redness in one mental space, an apple shape in another separate space. You experience a unified percept, red apple. Yet neuroscience shows that different brain regions process colour, shape, and object recognition separately. How does the brain bind these separate processes into unified experience? Classical explanations struggle here. You can describe synchronization patterns across brain regions, oscillations that coordinate activity, but synchronized neural firing is still just separate neurons firing at the same time. That doesn't obviously create genuine unity. Quantum entanglement offers something different. When particles become entangled, they form a single quantum system that cannot be described as separate parts. The system becomes genuinely holistic. If neural quantum states become entangled across brain regions, that might provide the physical basis for unified conscious experience. Hartmut Neven at Google's Quantum AI Lab has proposed experiments to test this directly. The basic idea: entangle a person's brain activity with qubits in a quantum processor. If consciousness depends on quantum entanglement, artificially increasing the quantum complexity coupled to someone's brain should produce measurable changes in their conscious experience. Subjects would report whether their awareness feels different when entangled with quantum systems compared to classical control conditions. These experiments haven't been performed. Technical challenges are formidable, creating stable entanglement between biological tissue and engineered quantum systems, maintaining coherence long enough for neural processes to respond, distinguishing genuine consciousness effects from irrelevant noise. But the proposal represents a shift. Quantum consciousness theories are moving from philosophical speculation toward testable predictions. Another experimental avenue involves isotope effects in anesthesia. Different isotopes of noble gases like xenon have identical chemistry but different nuclear spins, a purely quantum property. Some studies suggest these isotopes have different anesthetic potencies despite being chemically identical. If consciousness depends on quantum processes sensitive to nuclear spin, isotope effects would be expected. If consciousness involves only classical chemistry, isotopes should behave identically. The evidence remains preliminary and disputed, but it illustrates how quantum consciousness theories can generate specific testable predictions distinct from classical alternatives. Meanwhile, alternative quantum approaches have emerged. Joachim Kepler's zero-point field theory proposes that consciousness arises from the brain's resonant coupling with quantum vacuum fluctuations, rather than from quantum computation in microtubules. The quantum electromagnetic vacuum isn't truly empty, but filled with fluctuating fields, even at absolute zero. Kepler suggests specific frequencies in this zero-point field resonate with glutamate, the brain's primary neurotransmitter, creating coherence domains, where molecules vibrate in unison. This model offers potential advantages. The zero-point field is a fundamental feature of quantum field theory, not a delicate biological structure requiring special protection from decoherence. Coupling to a universal field might provide inherent stability mechanisms. The theory predicts specific electromagnetic signatures that could be measured experimentally, but it faces similar conceptual challenges. Even if brains couple to zero-point fields, why should that coupling generate subjective experience? The explanatory gap persists. Perhaps the most provocative recent evidence comes from twin studies examining quantum entanglement effects on cognition. Researchers designed experiments where identical twins performed cognitive tasks while their performance was correlated with entangled versus non-entangled quantum states in a quantum computer. The experimental group showed correlations exceeding classical limits, surpassing Bell's inequality thresholds. This suggests quantum entanglement might directly influence human cognition. These results require careful scrutiny and independent replication. The implications would be revolutionary if confirmed. But even if quantum effects influence cognition, this doesn't automatically explain consciousness. You could have quantum-enhanced information processing without subjective experience. The explanatory gap between objective processes and subjective experience remains regardless of whether those processes are classical or quantum. This brings us to a fundamental question about what counts as explanation. When we explain something scientifically, what are we actually doing? Typically, we're showing how some phenomenon emerges from more fundamental processes according to known laws. We explain chemical bonds by showing how they emerge from electromagnetic forces between electrons and nuclei. We explain planetary motion by showing how it follows from gravitational forces. Yeah, but consciousness seems different. Even complete knowledge of the physical processes occurring in a brain, whether classical or quantum, leaves open the question of why those processes are accompanied by subjective experience. Thomas Nagel articulated this in his famous paper, "What is it like to be a bat?" No amount of objective third-person description of bat neurology tells us what it's like to be a bat, to experience echolocation from the inside. Quantum consciousness theories might explain how certain information processing occurs. They might explain binding, integration, or the generation of complex cognitive states. But do they explain why any of these processes are accompanied by subjective experience rather than occurring unconsciously? Some philosophers argue this is asking the wrong question. Perhaps explaining the functional and physical basis of consciousness is all that explanation can do. Perhaps asking why physical processes generate qualia is asking for something explanations cannot provide, like asking what colour the number 7 smells like. Others maintain the hard problem is genuine. If consciousness cannot be explained by describing physical processes, classical or quantum, then either consciousness is fundamental and irreducible, or we need entirely new kinds of explanation beyond current physics. Quantum consciousness theories occupy uncertain territory here. They potentially explain more than classical theories about information integration and binding. But whether they explain consciousness itself or merely relocate the mystery remains contested. The philosophical debate intersects with empirical questions. If quantum effects in neurons are demonstrated conclusively, this changes the landscape, even if it doesn't solve the hard problem. It would show that quantum mechanics is relevant to neuroscience, that biological systems can harness quantum phenomena in ways previously unexpected. This matters regardless of whether it explains subjective experience. Current evidence remains preliminary. Quantum effects in biological systems are established in photosynthesis and avian navigation. Recent experiments suggest similar effects in microtubules. Whether these effects are relevant to consciousness or constitute irrelevant quantum noise remains unresolved. The decoherence problem, while less devastating than originally thought, still poses serious challenges. Anesthetic mechanisms remain incompletely understood. What we can say with confidence is limited. Quantum mechanics governs all matter, including brains. Whether quantum effects play functional roles in neural processes beyond what classical physics can explain remains an open, empirical question. Whether consciousness requires quantum processes or could in principle be explained classically remains unresolved. Whether any physical theory, quantum or classical, can ultimately explain subjective experience remains one of the deepest unsolved problems in science and philosophy. The question persists not because answers are impossible, but because the territory remains genuinely unknown. Consciousness sits at the intersection of physics, neuroscience, and philosophy. Progress requires contributions from all three domains. The experiments being proposed and conducted represent serious attempts to move beyond speculation toward testable hypotheses. Whether they succeed in explaining consciousness or merely deepen the mystery remains to be seen. The question isn't whether quantum mechanics governs brain tissue. It obviously does. Every atom in your skull obeys quantum laws. The real question is whether quantum phenomena play a functional explanatory role in understanding consciousness, or whether They're just background noise beneath classical neural dynamics. This distinction matters because several serious researchers now argue that quantum effects in neurons aren't merely possible, but necessary to explain certain features of conscious experience. They're not claiming consciousness violates physics. They're claiming that classical physics alone may be insufficient to explain how brains generate unified subjective states. Recent experiments have complicated this landscape considerably. In 2024, researchers confirmed superradiance in networks of tryptophans within microtubules, quantum effects persisting in the warm, metabolically active environment of living neurons. This wasn't supposed to happen. Standard decoherence calculations predicted these effects would vanish in picoseconds. Yet they persist for microseconds or longer, potentially reaching timescales relevant to neural processing. The significance isn't that quantum effects exist in brains. The significance is that they survive long enough to potentially influence computation. Whether they actually do remains unknown. Consider the binding problem. When you see a red ball moving left, visual processing occurs in anatomically separated regions. Color perception happens in one cortical area, motion detection in another, shape recognition elsewhere. Yet you experience a single unified object, not separate features. Classical neuroscience struggles to explain how dispersed neural activity generates unified conscious experience. Hartmut Neven, who leads Google's quantum AI lab, argues that quantum entanglement might solve this. Entanglement creates correlations between particles that cannot be decomposed into separate components. The system exists only as a whole. If neural processes involve quantum entanglement across brain regions, this could explain phenomenal unity in a way classical correlations cannot. The proposal isn't mystical, it's testable. Neven has outlined experiments where human subjects' brains would be coupled to quantum processors, their cognitive tasks linked to entangled versus non-entangled qubit states. If quantum entanglement influences human performance, this would constitute direct evidence that consciousness depends on quantum phenomena. Early results exist. A 2024 study examined 106 pairs of monozygotic twins performing implicit learning tasks. One group's tasks were linked to entangled qubits, another to classical circuits. The entangled group showed performance correlations exceeding Bell's inequality bounds, suggesting quantum effects influenced cognitive outcomes. These results require replication and scrutiny, but they represent the first empirical evidence that quantum entanglement might affect human cognition. The mechanism remains unclear. The Penrose-Hameroff orchestrated objective reduction theory proposes that microtubules in neurons support quantum computation. Quantum states in tubulin proteins allegedly persist long enough to influence synaptic dynamics, with consciousness emerging from orchestrated quantum state reductions. A newer theory by Joachim Kepler suggests consciousness arises from resonant coupling between cortical microcolumns and the quantum electromagnetic zero-point field. The zero-point field is the lowest energy state of quantum fields, persisting even at absolute zero. Kepler proposes that glutamate, the brain's primary neurotransmitter, resonates with specific zero-point field frequencies. This resonance creates coherence domains where molecules vibrate synchronously, potentially stable enough to influence neural dynamics. These theories differ mechanistically, but share a core claim. Consciousness requires quantum phenomena to generate the phenomenal qualities we actually experience. Classical computation can process information and produce intelligent behaviour. But according to these theories, it cannot generate subjective experience. This brings us back to the hard problem. Explaining consciousness means explaining why any physical process, quantum or classical, should be accompanied by subjective experience. Quantum theories potentially explain how brains integrate information or maintain coherent states. Do they explain why these processes feel like something? Some philosophers argue quantum theories merely relocate the mystery. David Chalmers notes that just as there's no obvious reason why classical neural firing should generate qualia, there's no obvious reason why quantum coherence should either. The explanatory gap remains even if quantum effects are confirmed. Others suggest quantum theories make progress on the combination problem. Panpsychism proposes that consciousness is fundamental, with micro-experiences somehow combining to form macro-consciousness. But how do separate proto-conscious elements unite into your unified field of awareness? Classical physics offers no mechanism. Quantum entanglement does. Entangled systems cannot be decomposed into independent parts. They form genuine wholes. If consciousness requires this kind of non-separable unity, quantum entanglement becomes explanatorily necessary rather than merely interesting. The theory wouldn't just describe neural mechanisms, it would explain why consciousness has the structure it does. The experimental challenges are formidable. Confirming quantum effects in living brains requires detecting coherence in systems that are warm, wet, and metabolically active, exactly the conditions that destroy quantum states. The decoherence problem hasn't disappeared. It's been weakened but not eliminated. Max Tegmark's original calculation suggested quantum coherence in neurons would survive less than a trillionth of a second. Subsequent corrections extended this to microseconds under specific assumptions about screening and protection mechanisms. Whether these assumptions hold in actual neurons remains contested. Some evidence supports protective mechanisms. Microtubules are surrounded by ordered water layers that might shield quantum states. Debye layers of counterions could provide electromagnetic screening. Biology has evolved quantum error correction in photosynthesis. Similar mechanisms might exist in neurons. But even if quantum coherence survives milliseconds, this doesn't prove relevance to consciousness. The brain performs countless quantum processes that have nothing to do with subjective experience. Proving causal relevance requires showing that disrupting quantum coherence disrupts consciousness in specific predictable ways. Anesthesia provides one testing ground. General anesthetics bind to hydrophobic pockets in various proteins, including microtubules. The Meyer-Overton correlation shows anesthetic potency correlates strongly with lipid solubility across several orders of magnitude. This suggests a common mechanism involving hydrophobic binding sites, exactly where quantum effects in microtubules would occur. Studies show that drugs binding to microtubules can delay anesthetic-induced unconsciousness in rats. This suggests microtubules play some role in consciousness. Whether that role is quantum remains unresolved. The universality of anesthetics is striking. The same vapours that render humans unconscious also reversibly halt motility in single-celled organisms lacking neurons. Claude Bernard observed that anything alive can be anaesthetised. If consciousness requires complex neural networks, why do anaesthetics work on paramectia? Quantum theories suggest consciousness might involve fundamental cellular mechanisms rather than neural complexity alone. A Chapman University study complicates the picture further. Their analysis suggests agency and intelligence cannot exist in purely quantum systems. The quantum no-cloning theorem prohibits copying quantum states. But memory, comparison, and decision-making require information duplication. This implies consciousness, whether biological or artificial, requires hybrid quantum classical architectures. Biological systems already operate this way. Quantum effects influence classical neural dynamics, but brains aren't quantum computers in any simple sense. They're hybrid systems where quantum processes modulate classical computation. This might be necessary rather than accidental. Google's proposed experiments aim to test this directly. By coupling human subjects to quantum processors, researchers could manipulate the quantum complexity of systems linked to conscious tasks. If increasing quantum entanglement enhances or alters conscious experience, this would constitute strong evidence for quantum consciousness theories. The xenon isotope effect provides another potential signature. Different isotopes of xenon differ only in nuclear spin, a purely quantum property. Yet some studies suggest they have different anesthetic potencies. If confirmed, this would show that quantum properties directly influence consciousness, since the isotopes are chemically identical. None of this proves quantum theories correct. It shows they make testable predictions distinguishable from classical alternatives. Whether the predictions hold remains to be determined. Stephen Hawking criticized Penrose's theory by suggesting it committed a fallacy. Consciousness is mysterious, and quantum mechanics is mysterious. Therefore, they must be related. This captures genuine concern about quantum mysticism. But serious quantum consciousness research involves specific mechanistic proposals, not vague analogies between mysteries. The distinction between metaphorical and literal quantum theories matters here. Quantum cognition uses quantum probability mathematics to model decision-making without claiming actual quantum processes occur. This approach has gained respectability precisely because it avoids controversial biological claims. But success of quantum mathematics in modeling cognition doesn't prove quantum physics underlies consciousness. It might merely show that quantum formalism provides useful modeling tools. Current evidence remains preliminary. Quantum effects in biological systems are established in photosynthesis and bird navigation. Recent experiments suggest similar effects in microtubules. Whether these are relevant to consciousness or constitute irrelevant quantum noise remains unknown. The philosophical debate intersects empirical questions. If quantum effects in neurons are conclusively demonstrated, this changes the landscape even without solving the hard problem. It would show quantum mechanics is relevant to neuroscience, that biological systems harness quantum phenomena unexpectedly. This matters regardless of whether it explains subjective experience. What we can say is limited. Quantum mechanics governs all matter, including brains. Whether quantum effects play functional roles beyond classical physics remains an open empirical question. Whether consciousness requires quantum processes or could be explained classically remains unresolved. Whether any physical theory can ultimately explain subjective experience remains one of science and philosophy's deepest problems. The territory remains genuinely unknown. Progress requires contributions from physics, neuroscience, and philosophy. The experiments being proposed represent serious attempts to move beyond speculation toward testable hypotheses. Whether they succeed in explaining consciousness or merely deepen the mystery has yet to be determined. The question isn't whether quantum mechanics happens in the brain. That's settled. Every atom obeys quantum rules, including those in neurons. The actual question is whether quantum effects matter functionally, whether they explain anything about consciousness that classical physics cannot. This distinction has become blurred in recent discussions. Some experiments show quantum phenomena in biological molecules. Others claim these phenomena relate to consciousness, but showing quantum effects exist doesn't demonstrate they're relevant to mental states. The gap between correlation and mechanism remains vast. Consider the twin study involving quantum entanglement. Researchers linked cognitive tasks in monozygotic twins to entangled versus non-entangled qubits via quantum processors. The experimental group, whose tasks were coupled to entangled qubits, showed performance differences that exceeded Bell inequality thresholds. This suggests superquantum correlations might influence human cognition, but several interpretive problems emerge immediately. The experimental setup doesn't demonstrate that brains use entanglement natively. It shows that artificially coupling human tasks to entangled systems can produce unusual statistical signatures. Whether this reflects genuine quantum processes in neural tissue or artifacts of the experimental protocol remains ambiguous. The research does establish something significant. Quantum systems can be interfaced with cognitive processes in ways that produce measurable effects. This matters regardless of whether it explains consciousness. It demonstrates that quantum information, processing, and neural processing aren't completely separate domains. They can interact. Yet this raises more questions than it answers. If entanglement can influence performance, through what physical substrate does this occur? The experiment doesn't identify specific neural mechanisms. The coupling happens through external quantum processors, not through microtubules or any other proposed quantum structure within neurons. The zero-point field hypothesis offers a different approach. Rather than locating quantum effects in specific cellular structures, it proposes that consciousness emerges from resonant coupling between neural activity and the electromagnetic vacuum. Glutamate, the brain's primary excitatory neurotransmitter, resonates at specific frequencies with zero-point field modes according to quantum electrodynamic calculations. This model has theoretical advantages. The zero-point field is ubiquitous and doesn't require protected quantum states in warm biological environments. Coupling to a universal field might provide inherent stability against decoherence. The mechanism differs fundamentally from Orch OR while still invoking quantum phenomena, but experimental validation remains minimal. The theory makes predictions about microwave fields in cortical microcolumns and their effects on ion channels. Testing these predictions requires measurements at scales and sensitivities current neuroscience technology struggles to achieve. The model remains largely theoretical. Both approaches face a deeper problem that Stephen Hawking identified. Consciousness is mysterious. Quantum mechanics is mysterious. Therefore, they must be related. This inference pattern appears repeatedly in quantum consciousness literature. It's not clear the two mysteries connect rather than simply coexist. The hard problem of consciousness asks why physical processes give rise to subjective experience at all. Introducing quantum mechanics doesn't obviously address this. Even if microtubules maintain quantum coherence, and this coherence influences neural computation, why would quantum computation feel like something when classical computation supposedly doesn't? David Chalmers makes this point explicitly. Just as there's no particular reason macroscopic neural activity should generate consciousness, there's no particular reason quantum superposition should either. The explanatory gap remains. Quantum theories might describe consciousness's physical substrate more accurately, without explaining why that substrate produces experience. This doesn't render quantum approaches worthless. They might still be correct as neuroscience without solving the hard problem. If consciousness requires quantum processes, this would revolutionize our understanding of the brain, even if it doesn't explain subjectivity itself. The distinction between mechanism and meaning matters. Current neuroscience operates almost entirely within classical approximations. Neural firing patterns, synaptic transmission, network dynamics, all described using differential equations that ignore quantum effects. If quantum processes turn out to be functionally relevant, this entire framework would need revision. The anesthetic evidence provides one of the strongest empirical hooks. Anesthetics universally suppress consciousness across vastly different organisms, from humans to paramecia. The Meyer-Overton correlation shows anesthetic potency scales with lipid solubility across orders of magnitude. This suggests a common mechanism involving hydrophobic binding sites. Microtubules contain hydrophobic pockets where quantum coherence has been proposed. Anesthetics bind to these sites. Studies show that drugs protecting microtubules from anesthetic binding delay unconsciousness in rats. This suggests microtubules might be functionally relevant to consciousness, though it doesn't prove quantum effects are involved. The xenon isotope effect provides more direct evidence. Different isotopes of xenon differ only in nuclear spin, a purely quantum property. They're chemically identical, yet some studies suggest they have different anesthetic potencies. If confirmed through rigorous replication, this would demonstrate that quantum properties directly influence consciousness. But the isotope effect remains controversial. Not all studies replicate it. Sample sizes are often small, the effect size is subtle, and alternative explanations involving slight differences in how isotopes interact with protein binding sites haven't been fully ruled out. The evidence is suggestive, but not definitive. Google's proposed experiments represent the most ambitious attempt to test quantum consciousness theories directly. By entangling human subjects with quantum processes and manipulating the quantum complexity of coupled systems, researchers could determine whether increasing entanglement enhances or alters conscious experience. The expansion protocol assumes that if consciousness depends on quantum coherence, artificially increasing quantum complexity should produce measurable changes in subjective experience. Subjects would report richer awareness, altered perceptions, or enhanced cognitive capabilities. The hypothesis is testable in principle. However, enormous technical and ethical challenges remain. How do you safely entangle a human brain with qubits? What constitutes meaningful coupling? How do you measure changes in conscious experience reliably? What controls account for expectation effects? These questions don't have obvious answers. The binding problem in neuroscience offers quantum theories their strongest conceptual foothold. Information about a red apple is processed in separate brain regions. Colour here, shape there, semantic meaning elsewhere. Yet you experience a unified percept, not disconnected features. How does the brain integrate distributed information into coherent experience? Classical neuroscience lacks a compelling answer. Synchronized neural firing provides temporal correlation, but doesn't explain phenomenal unity. Quantum entanglement offers a different kind of binding, non-local holistic states where components cannot be described independently. This could explain how separate brain regions form unified conscious moments. But this explanation faces its own difficulties. Brain regions aren't isolated quantum systems. They're warm, wet, metabolically active environments, constantly exchanging energy with surroundings. Maintaining entanglement across neurons requires protection mechanisms biology may not provide. The decoherence problem hasn't been solved, even if some progress has been made. Recent microtubule experiments show quantum effects persisting longer than expected. Laser excitation propagates through microtubules farther than classical physics predicts. Anesthetics alter these properties, suggesting functional relevance. Superradiance in tryptophan networks has been confirmed despite warm temperatures. These findings establish that quantum phenomena occur in neural structures. They don't establish that these phenomena explain consciousness. The effects might be biologically relevant without being relevant to subjective experience. Quantum processes could influence neural computation, while consciousness still emerges from classical dynamics at higher organizational levels. The distinction between literal and metaphorical quantum theories matters here. Quantum cognition uses quantum probability mathematics to model decision-making without claiming actual quantum processes occur. This approach has gained respectability by avoiding controversial biological claims while demonstrating that quantum formalism provides useful cognitive modeling tools. Success of quantum mathematics in modeling cognition doesn't prove quantum physics underlies consciousness. It might simply show that certain cognitive patterns share mathematical structure with quantum systems. The map isn't the territory. Mathematical similarity doesn't imply physical identity. Chapman University's finding that agency requires hybrid quantum classical architectures adds another layer. Pure quantum systems can't copy or compare information due to the no-cloning theorem, but memory, decision-making, and deliberation all require information duplication. This suggests consciousness, whether biological or artificial, must combine quantum and classical processes. Biological systems already operate this way. Quantum effects influence classical neural dynamics, but brains aren't quantum computers in any simple sense. They're hybrid systems where quantum processes modulate classical computation. This might be necessary rather than accidental. Yet this raises questions about artificial consciousness. If consciousness requires quantum processes, classical computers cannot become conscious regardless of software sophistication. Conscious AI would need quantum components. But if hybrid architectures suffice, the boundary between conscious and unconscious systems becomes unclear. What we can say with confidence remains limited. Quantum mechanics governs all matter, including brains. Whether quantum effects play functional roles beyond classical approximations is an open empirical question. Whether consciousness requires quantum processes or could be explained classically remains unresolved. Whether any physical theory can ultimately explain subjective experience remains one of science's deepest problems. Progress requires contributions from physics, neuroscience, and philosophy simultaneously. The experiments being proposed represent serious attempts to move beyond speculation toward testable hypotheses. Whether they succeed in explaining consciousness or merely deepen the mystery has yet to be determined. The territory remains genuinely unknown. What has changed is the quality of questions being asked and the sophistication of experimental approaches available to address them. The experimental program has matured. Theoretical frameworks have been articulated with increasing precision. Yet the central tension remains unresolved. If quantum mechanics is confirmed to play functional roles in neural processing, this would constitute a significant advance in neuroscience. It would require revising our understanding of how brains compute and integrate information, but it wouldn't automatically solve the hard problem of consciousness. This distinction needs emphasis. Mechanism and meaning are separate questions. You can have a complete physical account of how consciousness is implemented without explaining why that implementation generates subjective experience. Quantum theories potentially improve our understanding of the mechanism. Whether they address the meaning remains contested. The binding problem illustrates this clearly. If quantum entanglement explains how spatially distributed neural processes form unified conscious states, that's genuine progress. It answers a question classical neuroscience struggles with, but it doesn't explain why unified states feel like anything. The phenomenal aspect of consciousness, the qualia, the subjective character of experience, remains as mysterious with quantum binding as with classical synchronization. Some philosophers argue this is the wrong expectation. Physical theories explain structure and dynamics, not intrinsic qualities. Asking why quantum coherence generates qualia might be like asking why mass generates gravity. It confuses explanation with elimination. Physical theories describe relationships between measurable quantities. They don't reduce those quantities to something more fundamental, ad infinitum. Others maintain the hard problem is genuine and inescapable. Physical description, however complete, leaves a gap between objective processes and subjective experience. This gap persists whether the processes are classical or quantum. Quantum consciousness theories might provide better physics without providing better philosophy. The experimental evidence accumulating suggests quantum effects do occur in biological systems more robustly than once thought possible. Photosynthesis and avian magnetoreception established this in specialized contexts. Recent work on microtubules extends it to neural structures. Whether these effects matter for consciousness specifically remains the open question. Anesthesia provides the most promising empirical handle. The universality of anesthetic action across organisms, the correlation between anesthetic potency and hydrophobic binding, the delayed unconsciousness when microtubules are stabilized. These observations suggest microtubules might be functionally relevant to consciousness. Whether their relevance involves quantum processes awaits definitive demonstration. The isotope effect in xenon anesthesia, if conclusively confirmed, would provide strong evidence that quantum properties influence consciousness. Chemical identity with nuclear spin variation offers an unusually clean test, but the effect remains at the edge of detectability, requiring careful replication with larger samples and rigorous controls. Google's proposed expansion protocol represents the most direct test yet conceived. Coupling human subjects to quantum processes and measuring consciousness changes as entanglement increases would directly address whether quantum complexity enhances awareness. The technical challenges are formidable, but the conceptual clarity is unprecedented. The experiment tests a specific prediction that consciousness scales with quantum informational complexity in measurable ways. Whether these experiments will yield positive results, negative results, or ambiguous results that require further refinement remains unknown. The important development is that the question has moved from purely theoretical speculation to experimental investigation. Quantum consciousness theories now make testable predictions distinct from classical alternatives. Science can proceed. The Chapman University finding about hybrid architectures adds nuance. If agency requires both quantum and classical resources, this constrains what quantum theories can claim. Consciousness cannot be purely quantum any more than it can be purely classical. The The question becomes what roles quantum processes play within hybrid systems, and whether those roles are functionally significant or merely present. Biological systems already operate as hybrids. Quantum effects influence classical dynamics throughout metabolism, signal transduction, and genetic regulation. The question isn't whether quantum mechanics matters in biology. It obviously does. The question is whether it matters specifically for consciousness in ways that illuminate the hard problem. Current evidence suggests quantum effects might explain certain features of neural processing, binding, integration, perhaps aspects of memory or decision-making. These would be significant advances in neuroscience even without solving the hard problem. But solving the hard problem requires explaining why any physical process, quantum or classical, generates subjective experience rather than proceeding unconsciously. Some approaches attempt this through panpsychism or its variants. If consciousness is fundamental and ubiquitous, physical theories only need to explain how fundamental micro-experiences combine into macro-consciousness. Quantum entanglement potentially solves the combination problem by providing a physical basis for genuine unity. But this requires accepting that consciousness is primitive rather than emergent, a controversial metaphysical commitment. Others pursue emergence more directly, arguing that consciousness arises from complex information integration, whether implemented classically or quantumly. Integrated information theory attempts to quantify consciousness through mathematical measures of integration. Whether these measures track phenomenal consciousness or merely functional complexity remains debated. The landscape has shifted from 2 decades ago, when quantum consciousness theories were largely dismissed as quantum mysticism. Serious experimental work has begun. Theoretical frameworks have been refined. Empirical evidence, while preliminary, has accumulated. The question has been elevated from fringe speculation to legitimate scientific investigation. Yet the fundamental questions remain open: whether quantum mechanics is necessary for consciousness, whether it's sufficient, whether it explains anything about subjective experience beyond neural mechanism, whether any physical theory can bridge the explanatory gap between objective processes and subjective awareness. These questions may not have definitive answers in the near term. Consciousness research operates at the boundary of what science can currently address. The measurement problem in quantum mechanics and the hard problem in philosophy of mind both involve deep conceptual puzzles about observation, measurement, and experience that resist easy resolution. What has changed is the sophistication of questions and approaches. Rather than vague analogies between quantum weirdness and consciousness mysteriously, researchers now propose specific mechanisms and experimental tests. Rather than invoking quantum mechanics as magic, theories articulate how quantum processes might contribute to neural function in ways consistent with known physics. The territory remains largely unmapped, but the tools for mapping it have improved considerably. Whether those tools will prove adequate to the task, or whether consciousness ultimately requires conceptual resources beyond current physics and neuroscience, remains genuinely unknown. The question matters not because answers are imminent, but because pursuing it reveals the boundaries of current understanding. Where those boundaries lie, what lies beyond them, and whether they can be crossed are questions that require continued investigation across multiple disciplines. The conversation between physics, neuroscience, and philosophy of mind has become more sophisticated and empirically grounded. That represents progress, even absent final answers. What quantum consciousness research has accomplished is moving the discussion from whether quantum effects could matter to whether they actually do. That shift from possibility to actuality requires experimental evidence that is only beginning to accumulate. The next decade will likely determine whether quantum theories of consciousness represent a genuine advance in understanding or a detour that, however intellectually stimulating, ultimately leads nowhere. For now, the question remains what it has always been: genuinely open. Neither proven nor disproven, neither obviously correct nor obviously misguided, just unresolved, awaiting evidence that current experiments are beginning to provide.